It's my life, it's now or never. I ain't gonna live forever. I just wanna live when I'm alive.
Dr. Bernhoft stopped being a surgeon a very long time ago and now works as an environmental health specialist, perpetrating a whole lot of medical myths which have long since been debunked by mainstream researchers. Some might call him a quack. I don't want to get sued, so I won't. Dr. Bernhoft is also a convert to Catholic fundamentalism. He describes himself as a Catholic educational apostolate or religious leader. In that capacity, he's the co-host of a syndicated weekly Catholic radio and television show. Let's cut to the shorthand here. The good doctor is a fundamentalist Catholic televangelist. And voluntary euthanasia isn't the only issue in which Dr. Bernhoft's religious beliefs override his scientific training. For example, he cheerfully ignores 200 years of accumulated scientific evidence for evolution to argue instead for the historical truth of Genesis. Revealing the ideological basis of his rejection of mainstream science, Bernhoft labels those who believe in evolution as atheists, the sexually immoral, abortion supporters, social Darwinists, racists, and violators of each of the commandments. I also found that as well as opposing voluntary euthanasia, Dr. Bernhoft, predictably, opposes abortion and same-sex marriage. In fact, he's written a whole book opposing gay marriage. Now, you may think gay marriage has nothing to do with voluntary euthanasia. You might even oppose it. But bear with me here because I want to make an important point. We already know that Bernhoft put out a false story about voluntary euthanasia. So what does he say about gay marriage? In arguing against gay marriage, Bernhoft says studies have shown a high incidence of incest between minor children and homosexual parents of both sexes. If I thought for 1 minute that was true, I'd be campaigning against gay marriage too. But if you look at the research, this is as much of a lie as the ballerina story. The fact is, not a single credible study supports this assertion. There is a study that advances this argument, but it has been totally discredited. And that study is from Paul Cameron, an American psychologist and sex researcher. Cameron established and is the head of the Family Research Institute. Let me tell you, if you spend your days countering religious propaganda, alarm bells start ringing when you find a group that has family in its name. I was sickened, but not surprised, to find that in 1995, Dr. Cameron described AIDS as a godsend. The Southern Poverty Law Centre, which monitors such things, lists Cameron's Family Research Institute as an anti-gay hate group. Dr. Cameron enjoys quite a tarnished reputation. He's been expelled from the American Psychological Association and a host of other professional bodies, which universally agree that he disgraces the professions of psychology and sociology by consistently misrepresenting research on sexuality, homosexuality, and lesbianism. In other words, he lies. Dr. Cameron and his research had been thoroughly discredited by 1983, and yet 22 years later, Dr. Bernhoft, or as I like to think of him, Ballerina Boy, quoted Cameron's shonky research to spread a spurious lie about homosexual parents being incestuous sex abusers. Now, the point I'm making is that Dr. Bernhoft and Dr. Cameron use identical strategies to counter the two very different issues of voluntary euthanasia and gay marriage. There is no credible evidence to support their positions, so they use anecdote, misinformation and scare tactics instead. And hiding beneath their titles and their academically phrased propaganda is an undisclosed fundamentalist religious agenda. I came across a very telling quote from Martin Luther the other day. Not Martin Luther King, this Martin Luther was the founder of Protestantism. He said, "What harm would it do if a man told a good, strong lie for the sake of the good and for the Christian church? A lie out of necessity, a useful lie, a helpful lie. Such lies would not be against God. He would accept them." So I'd like you to think about this, especially if you're one of those well-meaning people who might oppose same-sex marriage because of your concern for the children. Churches and their fundamentalist supporters are churning out lies and misinformation about gay marriage and gay parents as fast as they're churning out lies and misinformation about voluntary euthanasia. And if you're rejecting one lot of propaganda and accepting the other, you've just learned a valuable lesson about how insidious and dangerous this tactic is. If you've bought the lies and deception about the consequences of giving equal rights to homosexuals, you might understand how others buy into the lies and deception about the dangers of giving you the right to end your life with dignity. Now let me pause here to make it clear. I'm not for one moment making a blanket criticism of Catholics, Christians or religious believers of any persuasion. In fact, on social issues, congregations are routinely more liberal than church bureaucracies. I'm sure you'll be aware that a recent survey shows a clear majority of Australian Christians are in favour of voluntary euthanasia. So I'm not attacking the average person who goes to church on Sunday. And I do understand why some of them accept the propaganda they hear from the pulpit. I still get shocked when I hear someone who says they're a Christian telling great, big, hairy lies. Really, it shouldn't, but it shocks me. I really can't get my head around that level of hypocrisy. So I'm not anti-religion, and I'm not against free speech or honest debate. What I'm against is people making stuff up in order to restrict other people's rights and freedoms. And this is where David and I began to realise that the causes we were fighting separately really had a lot in common. The forces that oppose voluntary euthanasia are the same forces responsible for the pernicious infiltration of evangelical religion into our governments, and particularly into education, health and welfare. They're the ones delaying justice for those who've been sexually or physically abused by the clergy. It's religious groups and their supporters who oppose stem cell research. These are the same people who believe their values should determine what websites you can access on the internet or what movies you should be allowed to see. And at the very core of all these disputes is your right to freedom from other people's religions. On this basis, the battle to be able to die with dignity is not that different to the battles being fought over, let's say, women's reproductive rights, same-sex marriage and adoption rights, and the insanity of placing evangelical religious chaplains into schools at the expense of youth workers with tertiary qualifications in mental health. Any of these issues might be won tomorrow if governments could be persuaded not to buckle under pressure from religious groups and instead make decisions based on credible evidence. If politicians recognised and rejected religiously biased propaganda and respected the right of freedom from religion as well as freedom of religion, we could all pack up and go home. And that's why 2 years ago I co-founded a group we've called Reason Australia. Reason Australia is a national lobby group. It aims to improve the standard of public debate in Australia and to hold governments to account for policies which ignore credible evidence and research in favour of misinformation from ideologically driven pressure groups, particularly religious groups. Reason Australia has been established to address the problem that the churches are organised and we, their secular opposition, are not. We're fragmented into hundreds of different groups fighting individual issues on hundreds of different fronts and mostly with very scarce financial and human resources. At Reason Australia, we recognise that it's secularism that protects our right not to have others impose their religious values on us and our families. This is not anti-religion. Of course, people should be free to practice their own religion, but that freedom shouldn't extend to inflicting it on the wider population, and particularly not at taxpayers' expense. In fact, secularism was designed not to protect the rights of atheists, it was designed to protect religious denominations from each other. Whether like-minded groups and their members choose to become affiliates or just friends or individual supporters, we hope Reason Australia will encourage alliances between all kinds of different groups in order to achieve our common goals. Now, 20 years ago, this would have been very difficult. But today, the internet makes networking easy. It also makes the media far more accessible. For example, many of my Facebook and Twitter contacts are columnists and journalists with a particular interest in issues relating to secularism. Contrary to what you might have heard about Facebook and Twitter, they're not just forums for teenagers to chat their latest crush or for boring people to drone on endlessly about their boring lives. These social networking sites are increasingly being used very effectively for political lobbying and grassroots activism. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that what the churches are to the religious lobby, the internet is to the secular lobby. It's where we find our supporters, inform them, educate them, raise their political consciousness, unite them, and motivate them to take collective action. Ultimately, if every time the government caves to a religious pressure, there's an enormous storm of protest backed up by thoughtful articles and professional lobbying from groups like Reason Australia, we'll start to win this war and re-establish the Australia our founders envisaged, a secular nation with secular policies based on reason and evidence. Secularism is not anti-religion. Secularism means everyone has a right to believe whatever they want and to practice their own religion freely. But secularism also means that your religion does not trump my right to make my own decisions about my own body. And that includes the right to die with dignity. Thank you.
It's my life.